Welcome to the deep dive. We take complex source material and pull out the core insights so you can get straight to the point. Now, when you mention UFOs, unidentified flying objects, most people's minds go straight to the sensational stuff, right? Blurry lights, maybe a little gray men.
Yeah, the standard picture. But our sources, and we're talking a deep look at close encounter literature over decades, they reveal something, well, frankly, more profound.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. The research we've looked at, including some really detailed analysis like a PhD thesis from the University of Kent, it suggests something fascinating.
It really does.
These modern close encounter reports, they seem to share this deep, almost uncanny connection with humanity's oldest spiritual stories.
Exactly. Things like shamanic journeys, near-death experiences.
Yeah.
They follow this archetypal pattern, a three-stage initiation.
Right. And that's the core mission for us today, isn't it? To explore that ancient template. That's the similarity we see.
But then, crucially, we need to nail down the major differences in how that journey actually happens for people today.
Because it's not all the same experience.
Not at all. We're focusing squarely on the stark split between the contactee type of experience, which was big in the 1950s, and the abductee experience, which really took over the narrative later on.
And understanding that difference, you argue, is key to seeing how our own culture, our fears, our expectations about technology kind of shape these events that feel so otherworldly.
Precisely. It's about context.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. If we start looking at these encounters not just as like physical events,
Yeah.
but as modern takes on these ancient spiritual rites of passage, it completely reframes how we see the witnesses, doesn't it?
It absolutely forces a reassessment. If this link to traditional visionaries holds up, then these people shouldn't just be dismissed as, eccentric or delusional.
They're more like visionaries whose experiences are just, well, the sources, couched in terms relating to life in a more modern age.
Exactly. It's initiation, but filtered through a lens of technology and space, not nature spirits or magic carpets.
Okay, so let's lay out that shared structure first, the foundation. You mentioned 3 stages.
That's right. The close encounter phenomenon, just like these older traditions, follows this universal rite of passage structure: separation, liminality, and reintegration.
Stage 1, separation. That's the moment things get weird, right? The break from normal life.
That's it. The divorce from the mundane. The instant the experiencer sort of leaves ordinary reality behind.
How does that usually happen in these modern accounts?
Often it's triggered by something sudden, overwhelming, a really bright light, strange sounds, or sometimes this thing researchers call the Oz factor.
The Oz factor.
Yeah.
I always found that description so evocative, that feeling where everything just goes quiet, dreamlike, like you've stepped behind a curtain.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's like your brain suddenly realizes the normal rules just paused.
Okay, so you're separated. What's next?
That leads you straight into stage 2, liminality, or you could call it the otherworld journey.
Liminality, like being on the threshold.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Separation is leaving the familiar room. Liminality is being in the hallway between places. You're in transition, you don't really have a status, and that's when you encounter the otherworldly beings.
Ah, okay. And you said this is where the contactee and abductee stories really start to diverge, even though they're both in that ball.
Automatically, yes. The journey itself feels very different.
How so?
Well, contactees often talk about transcending time and space, maybe floating through the stars, having these deep philosophical conversations, often telepathically.
Right, the cosmic chats.
Whereas abductees, they tend to describe being physically taken, often restrained. They find themselves in these sterile clinical environments, like operating rooms.
So internal and collaborative for the contactee versus external and forced for the abductee.
That sums it up perfectly.
And then stage 3 is reintegration, coming back.
Coming back, yes. Returning to ordinary life, but changed, permanently transformed, possessing what the sources call a new sacred identity.
So the template's the same: separation, ordeal, or journey, return. But the content of that middle stage really changes the whole meaning and the spiritual outcome.
Absolutely. It dictates the transformation. So let's pivot now, really focus on that content. Let's start with the contactee experience. That's mainly the 1950s vibe.
Ah, yes. The era of the friendly space brothers, often blonde, very philosophical.
You've nailed it. A contactee is someone claiming a friendly, usually extended relationship with aliens who often look quite human.
Sometimes they even get rides in the saucers, right?
Sometimes, yes, extended conversations, maybe trips. The classic example, everyone knows him, is George Adamski, 1952 California desert.
Met Orthon the Venusian.
Exactly. Tall, slim, blonde Orthon, radiating infinite understanding and kindness. That's the archetype. Orfeo Angelucci is another one. Met beings from Lyra and Orion.
They really do sound like space-age spiritual guides, don't they? Showing up with wisdom. What was the main point of these visits?
Okay, this is the key difference for contactees. The salvific mission, or gnosis secret knowledge.
Salvific, like saving.
Yes, they were explicitly chosen, they felt, to receive this divine or secret knowledge and then spread a message, a kind of gospel to humanity.
And what was the message?
Pretty consistent, actually. It was about universal salvation, this ongoing battle between good and evil, and crucially, urgent warnings. Warnings about human self-destruction.
Nuclear war being the big one.
Nuclear war, absolutely. But also materialism, pollution. Humanity losing its way.
So they weren't just random encounters. These people felt selected. They were effectively being turned into modern prophets.
That's exactly the feeling. Adamski, for instance, was given this whole last days scenario. Humanity could be saved, but only if they listened, followed moral laws, changed their ways. They had a public mission.
A gospel to preach, essentially.
Which brings up a really interesting psychological angle unique to the contactees. Cognitive dissonance.
The discomfort when your beliefs clash with reality. How did that play out?
Well, they were incredibly motivated. They'd lecture, start societies, write books. But their whole belief system was often tied to specific prophecies, timelines.
Right. So what happens when, say, the promised rescue fleet doesn't show up on the predicted date, or the catastrophe doesn't happen? That must be crushing.
It is, and they have to rationalize it. Take the famous case of Mrs. Keach and her followers, studied by Festinger. When the predicted flood and alien rescue didn't happen,
What did they do? Pack up and go home?
quite the opposite. They doubled down. They started proselytizing more intensely, claiming their faith had been so strong, the aliens decided to spare the world because of them.
Wow. So they resolved the dissonance by believing even harder?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had to justify their commitment.
Yeah.
That's a burden the abductee generally doesn't face in the same way because their mission, if you can call it that, isn't usually public prophecy.
Okay, that sets up the contrast perfectly. Let's move to the abductee experience. This really starts gaining traction with Betty and Barney Hill in the early 60s, and the tone shifts dramatically. It gets darker.
Much darker, yeah. If the contactee is the chosen prophet, the abductee is often portrayed as the terrified, passive victim.
Taken against their will.
Absolutely. Taken against their will by beings they often describe as malign agents, forced to endure experiences they describe as unimaginable torments.
And the setting changes completely too, doesn't it? No more friendly chats in the desert.
No. We shift from those kind of encounters to sterile clinical environments. Cold rooms, oft compared to hospital operating theaters, frequently lit by this intense, bright white light, but with no obvious source. It suggests high-tech, but impersonal, cold.
And this is where the core difference lies for abductees. The ordeal.
Yes, the ordeal. Abductees consistently report undergoing these invasive, often painful medical-style examinations.
Things like needles, probes.
Needles inserted into the head, the neck, the navel, reports of genetic material being harvested, sometimes procedures related to reproduction, even forms of sexual violation.
That sounds horrifying.
It is. And what's chilling from an analytical perspective is how closely this ordeal mirrors accounts of ritual dismemberment or spiritual surgery in classic shamanic initiation stories from around the world.
But with a huge difference, right? The shaman often seeks that experience, or at least understands its purpose within their tradition. The abductee
is simply a subject, passive. There's generally no consent, no understanding given.
But hold on. If we call these terrifying non-consensual procedures a spiritual ordeal, aren't we kind of downplaying the trauma? These people clearly feel like victims.
And that is the absolute central tension the sources highlight. The trauma is real, undeniable. Psychologically, they are victims, yet the structure of the experience, separation, ordeal, transformation, aligns uncannily with that ancient initiatory pattern.
So the form is ancient, but the content reflects modern fears.
Exactly. And crucially, unlike contactees, abductees are usually given no mission, no clear purpose for why this is happening to them.
What do the aliens say, if they say anything?
Often, very little. Sometimes there's a tall, leader-type figure, maybe one of the Greys, who gives these really enigmatic, non-committal answers. like Betty Hill asking what they were doing and the response being something like, "You know what we're doing."
That's incredibly unsettling. That lack of clarity, the total power imbalance.
It's central to the abductee narrative, that feeling of helplessness, of being subjected to something incomprehensible.
And the types of aliens involved shift too, don't they? We move away from the Adamski-style handsome Nordics.
We do. The Greys become dominant, small bodies, large heads, big black eyes, seen as technological, maybe drones or biological robots. And sometimes more sinister figures like reptilians appear described as emotionless, manipulative.
So there's a whole complex discourse on race and otherness emerging here.
Absolutely. The sources argue the abduction narrative engages with ideas about race, technology, and the unknown other. In a way, the earlier contactee stories, with their mostly homogeneous, benevolent Nordics, simply didn't.
Do the Nordics still show up in abduction accounts?
Sometimes, yes. Interestingly, when they do appear alongside Greys, the Nordics are often framed as being somehow morally superior, maybe overseeing things, or even expressing regret, adding another layer of complexity. It reflects anxieties about who's really in control, the seemingly advanced technologists, Greys, or some other, perhaps more ethically ambiguous group.
It sounds like a reflection of anxieties about, I don't know, unchecked science, genetic manipulation, loss of control in a high-tech world.
Precisely those fears that really resonated in the later 20th century post-Cold War culture. Very different from the overriding fear of nuclear apocalypse that drove the contactee messages.
Okay, let's talk about the aftermath. Stage 3 again, reintegration. You said the template is shared, but the outcome is different. How so?
Well, there's a shared positive outcome first. Both contactees and abductees often report becoming more altruistic, more spiritual, developing a deeper concern for ecological issues. One study found, 85% reported increased planetary concern.
So the transformation towards being better humans seems consistent, regardless of how they got there.
It seems so. The experience, whether blissful or terrifying, tends to push people towards similar positive values. But the psychological price tag is where they diverge sharply.
How does that manifest for abductees?
Because of the trauma, the coercion, the invasive procedures, abductees often suffer from what researchers have termed post-abduction syndrome, or PAS.
Which involves?
Things like chronic sleep disturbances, nightmares, intense anxiety, panic attacks, depression, a persistent feeling of being watched or monitored, profound alienation from everyday life. They struggle with this jarring reality check when they return.
It sounds like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Very similar symptoms, yes. And unlike the contactees, who often became public figures, abductees tend to focus inward. Their journey becomes about personal healing, spiritual growth, trying to make sense of it privately, rather than preaching a public gospel.
That makes sense. You wouldn't necessarily want to shout about that kind of experience from the rooftops.
Exactly. And there's often this intense frustration, even anger, at being returned. They might have experienced something profound or peaceful in that liminal state, despite the fear, and then they're snapped back into their physical bodies, back to the terror and the confusion.
But here's the paradox you mentioned earlier, right? Even with the terror, some abductees find it beneficial.
Yes. It's fascinating. Many, like an experiencer named Mary, cited in the research, describe the horror, the dread, but still ultimately see the experience as positive, like a forced religious revival almost. They'll say it was a good thing because it fundamentally expanded their awareness, their spirituality.
Wow. So even trauma can be reframed as transformative initiation.
It seems it can be, for some.
Yeah.
So if we step back and look at the cultural framing, the contactee is clearly the prophet. They carry a public message, a gospel shaped by Cold War anxieties about morality and nukes.
And the abductee.
The abductee is the initiant, enduring a terrifying, high-tech spiritual ordeal, an experience deeply rooted in vulnerability, technological helplessness, fears of manipulation. But internally, it's often interpreted as a kind of technology of the soul, something that expands consciousness, even through terror.
The difference between a kind teacher warning you and being strapped to an operating table by unknown forces.
That really captures the shift. It's the difference between, say, 1950s hope and existential dread, and late 20th century paranoia about science and loss of control.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? It seems the close encounter experience, whatever its ultimate reality, operates on this incredibly ancient blueprint, this pattern of otherworld journeys.
But the content, that changes. It perfectly mirrors our shifting cultural anxieties. We went from, benevolent space philosophers worried about the bomb
to silent, clinical, cosmic predators conducting inscrutable experiments on us.
Exactly. But the core finding, perhaps, is that the transformative effect on the person seems remarkably consistent and often positive in the long run,
Increased altruism, spirituality, care for the planet. That happens whether the encounter felt like a blessing or a curse.
which suggests the experience itself serves a powerful function. Whether it's generated entirely from the subconscious drawing on cultural narratives, or it's triggered by some genuinely external phenomenon, it pushes individuals towards significant moral and spiritual shifts. The effect is real, even if the cause remains debated.
That leaves us with a final thought for you to maybe mull over. If contactee messages reflected Cold War fears of annihilation and abduction stories mirrored later fears of technology, bodily invasion, genetic tampering, what does the current evolution of the alien narrative, which seems to involve more interdimensional ideas, simulation theory, consciousness itself, tell you about the dominant anxieties floating around in our collective imagination right now in this post-digital age?
Something to think about.
Go take a deep dive into that. We'll see you next time.